Welcome to the Event Pro Show, your ultimate guide to the world of corporate events. Whether you're a corporate event planner, experiential marketing pro, producer, technician, or anyone involved in creating exceptional events, this podcast is your go-to resource for valuable insights, expert tips, and inspiring stories from the industry's leading professionals.
Well, thank you for joining us on this episode of the Event Pro Show. I am your host, Seth Mackey. I'm the CEO of LEMG. We're an event production company based out of Charlotte, North Carolina. And my guest today, I'm very excited about. I have admired her work from afar for years now. But my guest today is Sally Webb, a true pioneer in the events industry with more than 40 years of experience producing extraordinary events around the globe. Sally is the founder and former CEO of the special events company, now known as TSEC, leading events in more than 35 countries, earning over 40 international industry awards, and becoming one of the most influential figures in event management worldwide. But beyond her success as an event producer, Sally's also dedicated her career to educating the next generation of event professionals through programs at Wake Tech, Duke University, and industry certification initiatives that continue to shape our profession today. We're excited to have her join us and share lessons from her 4 decades of leadership, innovation, and building one of the most respected event companies in the industry. Sally Webb, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Seth. And I'd like to say I'm equally impressed with what you've done at LEMG as well.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And I see you're joining us. What is this? Are you in your office right now? You've got some cool stuff around you.
I've got a home office. So this is I have a physical office and I have a home office, but this is my home office with some of my memorabilia, my guitar from the Who tour when I have a charity that I co-founded with Roger Daltrey and Pete Townsend, and we support the development of programs for adolescent cancer throughout the US, and that proceeds from that Who tour came to our charity. So that was a little thank you from the tour.
That is very cool. Very cool. Yeah, that is unmatched paraphernalia on your wall right there.
Thank you.
So let me start. I could start in a bunch of places. I have too many questions for you to fit in this episode. But how did you get your start in events? Let's just start there. How did you get your start in the event world?
So there was really no such thing as the event world when I started. So I worked in sports PR and marketing for for the BBC sports anchorman called Desmond Lynam, who was a very famous sports guy, and he had a PR agency, and I worked for the PR agency. And in those days, really the only people who did events were PR agencies and ticket agencies. So there really wasn't such a thing as the event industry. So when I first started the company, at the time I believed I was the only event company in the UK.
Sure.
I've subsequently found out there were a few others around, and
all feeling like they were the only one.
Yeah, sort of. And ironic. So my company was acquired a couple of years ago by a big communications company out of the UK called DRP Group, and DRP Group was one of the only other event agencies around when I first started. So,
small world.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting how that whole kind of life cycle came around. But yeah, so I started off doing copywriting and basic PR functions, and then eventually I was basically just running events out of the company, and I just thought this could be quite a good business, this event business, and in 1986 I left the company and set up on my own, which was great because Des, who owned our company, just said, "Oh, just go and do the events anyway." So I ended up doing exactly the same events I did when I was employed, but did them for myself. So I had a very kind of lucky start. But, most people of my age in the event industry did not start their careers going into the event industry. They came from lots of different backgrounds, which is why I think people are really versatile and creative, because they had to be, there were no protocols to follow, there were no standards to follow. So we basically all kind of made it up as we went along. So that's how I got started. And then I started the company in 1986.
86
So
in the UK.
in the UK,
But you're
and then
sitting in North Carolina right now. What
I'm sitting in
happened?
North Carolina. So interestingly enough, it came through education, and
Mm,
it's kind of interesting how this one life event can be so life changing. So I was in '99. I was invited. There's a conference, annual conference called the Special Event Show. Nothing to
mhm,
do with my special event company, I hasten to add. Um, but I was asked to go and speak at the show in San Diego on how to produce an event outside the United States,
mm,
because we always did quite a lot of international events in like Europe and Asia and things like that. So I had a lot of expertise in that area. So I went to give this hour and a half session on how you organise an event that isn't in North America. And then somebody from Duke University came to my session and said, "Hey, look, we've got this big donor relations event in London
mhm.
coming up in about 9 months' time, and could you manage it for us?" And we did, and it was very successful. And then Duke University asked me to do some alumni events for them in Europe and in Asia. And then I was asked to come and meet with Coach K's team, and I didn't
Mhm.
even really know who Coach K was.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I sort of heard of him, but I had no idea how impactful that would be in my life. So he wanted to start a leadership program.
Mhm.
So I won that bid, which was astonishing because I didn't even have an office in America. I pitched for it, and I won it against some large companies, and
Mhm.
then went on to help Mike establish the Coach K Leadership Conference, and then
Oh, very cool.
people just kind of threw work at me, like, and he sort of almost became my number one salesman. And I got extraordinary people phoning up and saying, "Could you come and do our leadership conference?" And
Oh,
and
wow.
now in retrospect, I now fully appreciate the credibility and the power that gave me, having Coach K as my first customer.
For sure, for sure. The
So
ultimate client testimonial right there.
yeah, yeah, and then in about 2005. So basically, for 5 years, I was pretty much going like backwards and forwards between the UK and the US.
Mhm,
And by this time, I'm doing. I was doing Hendrix,
mhm.
some of their NASCAR work, and then I was approached by the US Naval Academy. So we were doing the Naval Academy Leadership Conference. So I'm doing basketball, NASCAR, and the Navy, and I didn't even have an office in America. So
Amazing.
in 2005, I thought I need to stop pretending that I don't live in America, because I'm
Right.
like backwards and forwards all the time. So I kind of I know this is really weird, but I psychologically moved myself to America, because even though I was physically here, mentally I wasn't. So I
Right.
kind of psychologically moved myself here, and then I opened a small office, and then it grew to a big office, and then I met my next husband here. Not my next husband, he's my current husband. But I met him here, and
Mhm.
he's English, but I met him in Raleigh. Um, and then so it's kind of interesting how that one, that going to give that one educational seminar changed the course of my life. And I've always been such a big advocate for people going out and teaching their art and teaching their skill,
Mm, yeah.
because you never know where that's going to lead you, but equally it's superbly gratifying to be able to do that.
I love that. And it comes from being prepared. I mean, the key I think is you were prepared, but the fun part about life is that you never know quite where it's going to end up, but you were
Yeah.
definitely ready for it when it happened.
Well, and what was kind of interesting is that there was a massive group of us from the UK that used to come over to this show, because back in at the night in the end of the 90s, the US was ahead of Europe in terms of event innovation and design and technology. So we all everyone knows everyone in the UK event industry. I mean, it's a pretty small place in comparison.
Right.
So we would come over in this like massive room. I mean, there were like 30 of us that would come, and just to learn and take it back. And it was kind of interesting how many of that group were going to kind of make it in America, and how, a few of us did,
Right.
but not that many.
Right.
Purely because getting through the immigration system is mind-blowingly complicated.
Just a nightmare. Yeah. Well, that's amazing. That's an amazing journey, and I feel like I always want to learn how people walk through life, but I think a lot of it is just life is interesting, and it can be a lot of fun if you're open to new things.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Seth, because I mean, it's sort of something I've always said to my kids as well. Like, you get, I always said it being about this kind of open window. You get people that will see an open window and they'll kind of run up to it and they'll pull it closed and shut it, and you'll get other people that just dive through it and
right.
There's a soft landing on the other side.
Right.
And it's the people that hope there's a soft landing that end up
I love it.
Somewhat more entrepreneurial than the others.
My wife calls me a whack-a-mole because, I'll try, and sometimes I get knocked down, but I just a second later I'll jump back up and be ready for the next challenge. I mean, that's something you got to have.
Oh yeah, I once went to an opening session, and there was a woman that had written a book called I think it was called Cold Face Black Heart. She was an Asian woman, and it was one of the most fascinating opening sessions I've ever been to. And she talked about that you can't truly experience success unless you've truly experienced failure. And she said one of the most profound things I've ever heard. And she said, when people get old, you get people that you look in people's eyes, and you get old people's eyes that have lived a life of lots and ups and downs. And then you get the people that have always played it on the safe side and have lived their lives kind of on a plateau. And she said, it's a bit like a heart monitor. Those people know they've been alive.
Yes.
And it really stuck with me.
Oh, I love that. And I think that's an entrepreneurial thing. So is that something you always wanted to be? Like, were you intentionally trying to be entrepreneurial, or were you just like, no, this is an opportunity, I think I'm going to jump through that window here?
I come from, in retro, never once did I ever set out and think I'm going to be an entrepreneur ever.
Right.
But I come from a family, a huge family. I come from this very traditional East London family where there's a million of us and everyone lives about a mile from each other. And I come from a family, all of my dad's got 8 brothers and sisters, and every one of them was superbly entrepreneurial, particularly the women. And I come from a family of really strong women, which for that age, back in the kind of, 50s, 60s was actually quite unusual. And like all my cousins are very entrepreneurial. So I think it's just totally in my DNA, but
it's in your blood.
Yeah. I never once thought, I want to be an entrepreneur. And ironically, I've had this conversation with Susan, who's my president, was my president of the Special Event Company. How many successful people we know that work in events whose parents have been entrepreneurs and self-employed? Like it's very.
Is it a high percentage?
Massively high percentage of people whose parents have had their own businesses and had to struggle, and because working in events, you are faced with pressure and adversity that does not exist in a lot of other industries. And I think if you've seen that as a child growing up, you can deal with that better.
Yeah. Yeah. You understand it. It comes
Yeah,
more naturally to you for sure.
100%.
I
Yeah.
agree. I agree with that. And speaking of trials and all the things that go along with events, really, when I was originally thinking of asking you to be on the Event Pro show, I heard you a few years ago speak on risk mitigation, and it just tucked it
Mhm.
away. Of like it was such
Yeah.
a great session, and I run an AV company. We think about risk and mitigating that, but from a AV perspective. But your presentation was very holistic, and it really was about the attendee journey and protecting them and protecting all stakeholders at an event. So, when you speak on mitigating risk at events, what are the main areas of risk at a live event that you're thinking about? Like if you have spheres that you're
Yeah.
thinking about.
So risk management is my absolute number one primary top subject that
Mm,
everyone who works in events should be more knowledgeable about.
mm-hmm,
So there's kind of there's really three areas to consider in risk management. There is the obvious health and safety,
mm-hmm,
the health and safety risk to your attendees, and all the different variations that go with that. Does your AV company know to tape all the wires down and put reflective tape around the light stands and blah 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 blah? Have your
mm-hmm,
caterers got all the necessary all the obvious health and safety stuff. Then there is your own personal liability risk. Like, are you, particularly if you're employed by an agency, are you being asked to do something that could affect your own liability? Are you being asked to do something that you could somehow put yourself in some kind of litigious situation? So protecting your own personal reputation, whether you're self-employed, whether you own a business, or whether you are employed by somebody else, is of paramount importance. And then thirdly, there is risk management for your client. So are you doing anything that is going to jeopardize their reputation? And I always say, it can take a century to build a reputation. It can take about 10 seconds to destroy it with a bad event.
mm,
So are you doing everything you can to protect your client reputationally, financially? Has the thing that you've recommended to your client that is going to cost a lot of money, is that truly going to present the financial outcome that it said it was going to? So I think there's those three areas, and each one of those areas need to be considered individually.
mm-hmm.
So the guests, personally, your customer would be the three main areas that I always say to focus on.
So if your three areas, health and safety, personal liability, client risk management, those are huge areas.
They're all in their own right.
Right. And if you're say you're a new planner in the industry, what type of documentation should you create when thinking about managing risk at your events? Is that the first direction you should go? Should it be checklists and documents? And if you were going to create a documentation plan, what should you have?
So event management needs to be should not be retrospective.
Mm-hmm.
You need to be proactive, and you need to be thoughtful about it. Now, when I first came to the US, I was and remain horrified by the lack of attention that's given to risk management in this country. And I'll come on to the why. There's a story behind the why. I'll come on to that in a moment. But there is so little attention given to being proactive in risk management. Risk management in America is sweeping generalization here, but 90% of the time is about, have you got enough insurance to cover it in the event of there being an incident? It is not about the proactiveness of what can we do before we get to this event, to ensure that we have mitigated risk as much as we possibly can. So there are, I teach risk management. I teach it all over the world to lots of different groups. But the first thing you need to do is you need to understand how to prepare a risk management document. And preparing a risk management document is not rocket science. It is thoughtful consideration for everything going into that event that could have a risk associated with it for one of those three buckets that I talked about. So, and it doesn't matter whether your event is for 50 people or 50,000 people. You still need to go through these steps, because I always say, a doctor can normally only kill, in a bad incident could kill one person at one time. As an event producer, you have the ability to be catastrophic. I mean, I'm thinking of the so many of the recent concerts where people have been crushed because there have been bad event management protocols. So to prepare a risk management document, you get your team together, or you can think it through on your own, and basically just walk it through, like from the minute you start to load in. What is everything that's going to do? It's going to be weather. It's going to be transportation. What if your entertainers don't turn up? Are your vendors, are your materials flame retardant, of which so little attention is given to that in the US? Has everybody got their license? Is alcohol being served? What kind of protocols are being put in place with alcohol? What's happening with your volunteers? Is there ADA? If you have attendees that have accessibility problems, have you got the right sort of access points? Because again, that's an area that you can be sued for if you don't comply with ADA regulations. The first few times you do this, it's long and complex, and you're constantly updating it and thinking of things. But after you've done that for multiple times, you kind of get a template. So at the special event company, we have templates now. So we have forms that I've shared with multiple groups I've spoken to. So we have multiple forms with all the questions. You're not going to need all of these 150 questions on these forms, but some of these questions are going to prompt the thought process of, how do I find these questions out? Do you know, at the venue, do you know where all the exits are? Do you know where the defibrillators are? Who is in charge if there is an incident? What's the number that you call? It's pretty basic stuff from that level.
But the point is to do the mental exercise.
100%. And then you document it, and you can share it with your client, and your client can fill in the bits that you don't know, or you can share it with a venue, and try and dedicate somebody whose job it is to find out these answers and share it with the team if you don't want to do it yourself. Because make sure that everybody has read this and understands this, because when there is an incident, nobody has time to go back and refer to the risk management document. So making sure that everybody has adhered to it, making sure that everybody, making sure that all your vendors. So my biggest problem when I first came to the US is even explaining to our vendors what we needed from them in terms of a risk assessment. And I think we have taught an awful lot of people how to be more risk compliant in their events because of our background and training. And equally, from a customer perspective, if I were a procurement officer, I would 100% demand to know from any agency or vendor working for me what their risk management protocols are. So, if you Google the special event company, we come up as the #1 agency for risk management in the country, because we have been so proactive in instilling this in our team, in our vendors, in our clients as to why it's important. And whenever we're filling in an RFP, we will always put our risk management protocols in it. And I know for a fact that we're probably one out of 100 people that would do that. Companies
proactively before they're asked.
Proactively, because it's just part of our process and our protocol to include that.
What I think is super interesting about it, first of all, it's very obvious. It should be done. Anybody that plans and takes the lead on events, it should be done. And anybody providing services within events. But years ago, my dad and I learned how to fly little single engine planes. And, before you take off for the first time, your instructor's like, okay, I want you to mentally think, if the engine cut out right when you take off, where you can't turn around, you don't have enough altitude to turn back around to the runway, where would you land the plane in an emergency? And you do kind of a mental exercise. And the reason why is seconds matter.
Absolutely, 100%. Yep.
Yeah. So what you're talking about is, if you have a plan, if you've done the mental exercise, something happens, something rings a bell in your head. Like, I thought of this. I know where the defibrillators are.
Well, I'll give you an example, actually. So we did, it's maybe 15 years ago. We did a big anniversary party for a big software company. It was on the campus. It was outdoors. It was like 10,000 attendees. And one of the first things we did is we met with, once we were into the planning stage, we met with the security team and we said, we want to establish an evacuation protocol and policy. And they kind of almost laughed at us, and they said, well, it's an outdoor event, everyone will leave. And we said, well, they won't leave, because everybody had to go to their buildings, had to park at their buildings, had to be bussed in. If there is an incident, we need to have a policy and a protocol on how we're going to evacuate all these people back. So we talked about this very clear policy of how it would work, how long if we had to call the event, how long before calling means close it down. If we had to call it, who would be responsible? So who would be the person that would make that decision? And this huge storm cloud popped up, and we had to put our protocol into place, and it was flawless. And the storm that came in here was so strong that it blew our main stage away.
Wow.
Now, if we had not have had that really clear protocol and policy, there was nowhere for these 10,000 people to go. Like, there was no one building around it that was going to hold them all without there being a panic. And it was a real lesson in. It was a great lesson for our team, that everything that we'd preached, luckily it doesn't happen very often, we put it into practice.
Right.
But that just came with experience, that came, and now the whole team over there are super experienced in mitigating risk and putting
I love it.
protocols in.
And it doesn't really cost anything more. It's just a little bit of time.
It doesn't cost anything. And the great thing is, from a professional development perspective, you like to think that all your team are going to stay with you forever. Of course they're not. They're all going to, they move on somewhere eventually. And this is such a skill set that they can take with them. And when I've taught the class that you saw, Seth. I mean, I've lost count of how many times I've.
You could do it in your sleep, couldn't you? You could just teach it.
But no when people listen, like you listen to that hour and a half, however long make it presentation, you would never ever look the same way at an event again, ever. Because I use so many examples in there of things that have actually physically happened. I've done thousands of events of things that have actually happened. I use live examples, and I say, this is what happened, this was the incident, this was the outcome, this was how we managed it, this is what happened. The other piece of documentation, so apart from you've got the risk management document. Within the risk management document, there should be a list of all the key contacts, who the head of security, where is the nearest local hospital, all those key contacts should be documented down somewhere. The other super important is an incident report. And the reason that an incident report is so important is that if you have a major incident event, the people involved in the incident have up to 2 years to come back and claim from you for whatever damage they may think is going to happen. And I have literally had people, peers of mine, who have had people come back to them at 1 year, 11 months and 30 days and put the claim in. Because once you put the claim in that period, that claim can take years to play out. You just have to lodge it within that time frame. Now, in an incident report, you need to document exactly what happened, who witnessed it, who was party to it, take as many pictures as you can, get people in authority there to sign off on it. Because if somebody comes back to you just under 2 years later, the chances are you're not going to remember it. The chances are nobody that worked for you, nobody that's working for you, or they may have been all freelancers, is going to be around to collaborate it. And if it gets to a court of law, you need to have a very clear, documented understanding of what happened, so that you have the ability to fight it. And this is really interesting. In 40 years of having business, I have never once had a lawsuit. Ever.
Wow.
Because I've never had a bad debt, and I never had a lawsuit, because we have always been so proactive in managing this up front. And I think, probably sometimes it's probably made more luck than judgment, but we managed to keep all of our events and all of our customers really safe because we had the protocols to do that.
That's the statistic right there. I mean, you can prove that. And even if you did have an incident, just the protocols you have in place,
100%
protect everybody.
We have we have so many like mitigating ways of dealing with that.
Now, if again this theoretical planner that's learning about all of this, if there was specific training they were looking for? I want to get better at this. Are there online resources or places that you can go to learn a little bit more, or maybe this type of paperwork you're talking about, templates, maybe kits, or I don't know. Are there any training resources that you could point somebody to?
Yeah. So there are. I would say, first of all, to anybody, go to your local technical college. So the course that I've just produced for Wake Technical College here. There are lots of event professionals in almost every major metropolitan that are going and teaching courses to go and take these courses. It's a bit more, it's more complicated in the US than it is in the UK, because in the UK there are much stricter protocols and guidelines that are legislation around health and safety. So it's not optional in the UK, it's mandatory.
Well, let me switch gears. I'm going to come back to your education side because that's super interesting and I want to learn more. But what are differences? If you're looking at you've grown up in the States and you produced events in the States, but now you have your first event in Europe. What are the some differences in preparing for risk for a European or even a UK event, specifically?
So you're going to be shocked beyond shocked by the protocols that you have to have in not just in the UK, but in pretty much across Europe. So, for example, you cannot go on any site to set up without PPE, without personal protective equipment. You can't go without hard hat. You can't go without steel-toed boots. You can't go without high-vis jackets. You can't drive a forklift without your training. You can't go up into a scissor lift without your training. It is so strict because it is so governed by regulation. So if the reason that I came to the US so prepared with risk management is because in the UK, it is the law to have a risk management document before you go, an assessment before you go on site. It is the law that you have to be proactive in risk management. If I had an incident in the UK and that led to a fatality or serious injury or whatever, and I could not prove that I had been proactive in my risk management documentation, I would go to prison. It is that serious.
Wow.
My daughter is my daughter's working on Wimbledon this week. She builds. She's a production manager and she builds big tenting infrastructure. Now, anybody in the tenting, like you said, in the big production field is covered by massive, significant health and safety regulations that you have to adhere to. So she has taken an unbelievable amount of training courses. So she's taken the NEBOSH exam, which is the National Examination Board Safety and Health and Occupational Health exam, which doesn't just cover events, it covers health and safety across any whole spectrum of it. But there are certain, when she's managing the build for these big infrastructures, she has to have this NEBOSH certificate. And this NEBOSH certificate takes about 6 months. It's about 100. It's the equivalent of getting an associate's degree here.
Whoa!
But a lot of the sites, she has to have that NEBOSH, or else she can't do the job that she's doing to manage that on site. Equally, lots of people are now being asked for it's the CDM, construction design management program. When you're going out and building big expos and building big events and big tent structures and whatever, some places now look very favourably on you if you've got this construction design management. And she basically sat in with a bunch of builders to take it because it complies both to the building trade and to the event trade and to the tent trade. Admittedly, there needs to be something a bit in between because.
The Event Pro Show is a production of LEMG, video by Nick Barrett, audio and post-production by Prince Thompson. You can learn more about us at lemg.live.